Chapter 15. Church Life. The religious period of my life was spent in a small 3-room Seventh-day Adventist church in Lake Worth, Florida. The architecture of it made me think of it as a miniature Alamo, Navajo church, or John Wayne defended jailhouse. It had room for 75 worshipers, but was never at capacity. Except for 4 or 5 kids and their parents, everyone appeared to be at least 50 years old except for my parents and myself. There were larger Seventh-day Adventist churches to our north and to our south in Boynton Beach and West Palm Beach, each about 10 miles away. We often visited the bigger church for services and social activities. I would later coexist scholastically with other church kids when I was enrolled in the Seventh-day Adventist church schools in the larger churches. The most dreaded yet hilarious church service moment happened once a week. It was the post-offering prayer, faithfully performed by church elder Don Austin. This was the big prayer, the one leading into the sermon. Everyone had to be on their knees for this sacred soliloquy, which I thought was meant to add extra emphasis to the prayer to help God prioritize them to attend to those requests before all standing prayer content. I was glad God had decided on the kneeling position to be considered holy as opposed to a complex and uncomfortable yoga twister game position. The closed-eyed, passive-aggressive sermonette was guaranteed to last at least 12 minutes, as I timed it regularly on my Timex watch given to me on Christmas. For me, it was the most dreaded portion of the service. I believe Mr. Austin was cheating, reading from hidden notes, and attempting to artificially increase the impact of his words by taking lengthy pauses for dramatic effect. He teased us with these moments of silence, as we hoped it would miraculously be the end of publicly telling God what he already knew, so that he knew that we knew too, which he already knew. I would look around, as I knew God knew I was cool, and it couldn't mean that much to his overall scheme of things to be concerned about my head and eyelid positioning. All of the other observers of reverence had their heads down and eyes closed, except for some of my friends who would look and grin at each other, making mocking faces and eye rolls in reference to the holy Shakespearean marathon man at the microphone. We just knew God was laughing with us and rolling his eyes as well. The funniest part came near the end of the seemingly never-ending prayer when the knees, hips, and other various failing joints of the senior citizens began to cause them discomfort. The moans and groans of those in pain were misinterpreted by Mr. Austin as sounds of religious passion generated by his inspired words. He would then shift it up a gear, making it more impassioned, while the groans and moans turned into wails and quiet sobbing as their pain grew. I marveled more than laughed at the scenario, as I like no one to be in actual pain. No non-family children could sit together during a church service because of probable flatulence by one of the older members of the congregation during a silent or impactful moment during the sermon. Mr. Gibson was always good for 1 or 2 kid composure cracking rippers, the dead silence highlighting the unintended duck call. It was an extremely intimate church acoustically. Alone, a kid stood a better chance of muzzling his amusement, but combining the restrained laughter of 2 children is a recipe for reverence disruption and creates a laughter particle accelerator that forces a children's self-imposed exile to the front steps of the church to release some of the most powerful belly laughs ever experienced. Attempting to restrain laughter and failing to do so is one of my favorite experiences, especially with someone who is going through the same experience. It seems to be over, but all it takes is one look at each other to turn it back into a laugh fest. It's like quicksand. The more you fight it, the more it pulls you down. I was a physically capable kid for a 12-year-old, so freelance handyman and fellow church member George Litke took a chance and hired me to be his assistant for the summer of 1973. George was a sizable man at 6'3" and 250 pounds, but was forced to move like a rusty robot due to a bad back. His voice was loud and deep, but he sang extremely off-key. This complicated singing for the rest of the congregation. His bellowing rendition of Bringing in the Sheaves was entertaining for me, as I didn't know which note he was going to murder next, and in what alternate key. George drove a fairly new extended van chock full of tools and work-related supplies. I learned a lot from him that summer. We pulled up to a nice old house off of Parker Avenue, just south of Southern Boulevard. My first assigned task was to remove some invasive vines from a hedgerow surrounding the backyard of the antique sprawling stucco villa. That required probing the bushes to find the starting point of these vines and severing them there. The entire estate and owner herself were close to hitting the triple digits age-wise, and we were performing some long-ignored tasks. George handed me the loppers, went upstairs, and disappeared. I spotted a vine of prehistoric proportions running up the length of a 4-story pine tree. Its immense 5-inch diameter and its degree of attachment to the trunk gave the appearance of a tree in peril. I had seen the damage an unchecked vine could do. Luckily, the large loppers were big enough to encompass most of the vine, and I severed it in 2 places, removing a 1-inch section so I could rip it from its parasitic grip on the tree bark. I was about to begin tearing away the lower section of the vine from its millennia-long embrace of the trunk when George came lumbering around the corner and exploded. "What are you doing? Mrs. Langbine's gonna blow a head gasket. That's her pet vine. That's been there as long as she has." My heart sank as I went from nature's hero to villainous vine murderer, an assassin of an old lady's memories. George tin-manned his way to the van and returned with his staple gun and Elmer's yellow wood putty. He stapled the removed 1-inch section back into place, covering the cuts and the staples with a putty. Luckily, the vine survived, and it was our secret. I will forever be indebted to the Seventh-day Adventist religion for 2 reasons. Their values and morality provided me with a guidebook on how to be as a person, but their fervency to enforce these rules pushed me to ponder their beliefs and realize that it didn't add up for this 8-year-old. I couldn't wrap my young mind around the fact that God knew everything that was going to happen in the future and was able to avoid all the pain and sadness easily by altering the events leading up to the Lucifer dissension. And why was the devil allowed to wander among that which was still pure? Why wasn't Adam and Eve properly briefed? This sounded very fishy to me. I also had trouble believing that God would symbolically curse all future females in a manner he supposedly did for this fruit-biting incident. It must have been one hell of a nice piece of produce. It portrayed God in an ultra-petty light which contradicted the rest of his biblical description and portrayal. Being just a kid, I kept newfound revelations to myself and didn't make any waves in my home and religious social life.